The heat pressed down like a physical weight, thick with the smell of dust and unwashed bodies. It clung to her, a second skin over the thin, frayed cotton of her shift. Her feet, bare against the scorched earth, had ceased to feel the individual sting of pebbles and thorns. They were a single numb ache. She kept her eyes fixed on a crack in the warped plank of the trading post porch, a dark line that seemed to run all the way to the edge of the world. To look up was to meet the eyes of the men, and their eyes were worse than the sun. They ringed the small clearing, a loose circle of sweat-stained hats and cruel, bored squints. Their words were stones thrown for sport. "Too broad in the beam for a farmer's wife," one voice rasped, followed by a wet chuckle that slid into a cough. Another added, "Silas must have fed her well, at least." The laughter that followed was dry as the dust their boots kicked up. She felt the comments land on her skin, on her shoulders that were not frail, on her hips that were not narrow. She had learned long ago that her body was a text they all felt free to read and comment upon, a public ledger of her failings. Silas stood beside her, a hand gripping her upper arm with the casual ownership of a man holding a bridle. His voice, when he spoke, was slick with false bonhomie. "Sturdy," he announced to the crowd, giving her a little shake that made her teeth click together. "Good for work. Quiet, too. Won't talk a man's ear off." She did not flinch. She had been taught stillness by a world that punished movement. Her breath was a shallow thing, trapped in her throat. She was an object on an auction block, though there was no block, only the unforgiving dirt. The rope that bound her wrists was coarse and bit into her skin, but it was a familiar pain, a grounding reality in the dizzying haze of shame. For a long moment there were no takers. The sun beat down. A fly buzzed near her ear. The men shifted their weight, their interest beginning to fray like the hem of her dress. Disappointment, acrid and sharp, rose in Silas's scent. He had misjudged his market. She was not the delicate, biddable creature they might have bartered for. She was simply surplus, a burden he was trying to offload with a veneer of commerce. Then, through the shimmering heat, a figure separated from the deeper shadows of the livery stable. He did not walk so much as flow, a slow, deliberate movement that did not disturb the dust. The murmuring of the crowd thinned and died. He was Comanche. That much was clear from the line of his jaw and the straight, hard set of his shoulders. His hair was long and black, unadorned. He wore buckskin leggings and a plain shirt, weathered by sun and distance. He carried whole winters in his eyes. He stopped a dozen paces away, his gaze not on Silas, not on the gawking men, but on her. It was not like their looking. It was not a judgment or an appraisal. It was a simple, stark seeing. He saw the dust on her cheeks, the way her knuckles were white where she gripped her own bound hands, the tremor in her jaw she fought to conceal. He saw the crack in the porch plank she stared at as if it were a lifeline. For the first time all day, she felt a sensation other than shame. It was a strange, unsettling prickle of awareness. She felt seen, not as an object of scorn or pity, but as a living, breathing thing. A cornered animal, perhaps, but a living one. Silas, sensing a shift, puffed out his chest. "Interested, are you?" he called out, his voice taking on a new, mocking edge. "Got some beads? A few good pelts." The Comanche man did not answer. His silence was a presence in itself, vast and solid as the mesas that shimmered on the horizon. He simply watched her, and in his watching the world seemed to narrow to the space between them. The jeering crowd, the oppressive sun, the sour smell of Silas. It all receded, becoming a dull noise at the edge of this new, profound quiet. She held her breath, waiting. The land itself was holding its breath. Silas's bluster faltered in the face of that impenetrable silence. He cleared his throat, his grip tightening on her arm. He was a man who used words as weapons and shields, and against a man who used none, he was disarmed. The warrior, Haketh, finally moved his gaze from her to the pile of goods stacked near Silas's wagon. His eyes settled on a stack of 4 woolen blankets, dyed a deep indigo, goods he had intended to trade for salt and iron. He then looked at the 2 prime beaver pelts slung over his own shoulder, cured and gleaming, the product of a long season's trapping. He lifted his chin and gestured toward the blankets with a slow, deliberate motion. Then he pointed a single finger at her. The transaction was offered without a single word. It was clean, stripped of the taunts and posturing the other men reveled in. Silas stared, his mouth agape. For trade blankets, it was more than he'd hoped for. A laughable overpayment for a girl he was about to abandon anyway. Greed warred with pride. To be bested in a bargain by an Indian was an insult, but the weight of the wool was a powerful argument. His eyes flicked from the blankets to her, then back again. He saw her not as a person but as a commodity whose value had just inexplicably soared. And the pelts? Hakatha's voice came at last. It was low and steady, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, like water running over stone. It was not a request. The crowd stirred. This was no longer a joke. This was a serious trade. Silas's face flushed. The humiliation of the overpayment was now public. To refuse was to admit the girl was worthless. To accept was to be seen as a fool. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. The greed won. It always did with Silas. Done, he clipped out, releasing her arm with a shove that sent her stumbling forward. Hakath did not move to catch her. He watched her regain her balance, her head still bowed. He swung the heavy pelts from his shoulder and let them fall to the dust near Silas's feet. Then he walked past the trader, his movements unhurried, and stopped directly in front of her. She could smell the scent of sage and clean leather, a stark contrast to the stale whiskey and sweat she was used to. She kept her eyes down, her world reduced to the cracked toes of his moccasins. She braced herself for a rough hand, a jerk of the rope. Instead, she heard the faint click of a knife being opened. The blade, worn smooth with use, slid between her wrists. With a single, fluid motion, he severed the rope. The fibers sprang apart, and for a moment, her hands remained clasped together, frozen in a posture of bondage. Slowly, painfully, she lowered them to her sides. Red welts circled her wrists, angry and raw. She flexed her fingers, the tingling rush of blood a strange kind of pain. He did not touch her. He simply stood back, the knife already folded and gone, and waited for her to be ready. He gave her that, the dignity of her own time. He turned and started walking, not looking back to see if she followed. The expectation was as heavy and unspoken as his silence. She stood for a second, rooted to the spot where she had been freed. The whispers of the crowd pricked at her back. Silas was already snatching up the pelts and blankets, his victory a sour taste in the air. There was nothing for her there. Behind her was a cage she had just been let out of. In front of her was a man who had paid for blankets and 2 prime pelts for a person they all called worthless. She took a step, then another. Her bare feet followed in the faint prints his moccasins left in the dust. The journey was silent, a long thread of emptiness stretching between them. He walked ahead, his pace steady and even, never once looking back. She learned the rhythm of his stride, the straight, unwavering line of his back. The land they moved through was broken and hard, all sharp rock and thorny brush. The wind was a constant, mean presence, whipping her thin shift against her legs and filling her hair with grit. He stopped only once, beside a seep of green that marked an underground spring. He knelt, drank from his cupped hands, then filled a small water skin. He held it out to her. His hand was steady, his gaze fixed on the horizon. She took it, her fingers brushing his for a half-second. His skin was warm and dry, like sun-baked stone. The water was cool and tasted of earth and minerals. It was the first true kindness she had known in years. She drank until her stomach ached, then handed the skin back. He took it without a word and they moved on, the dust lifting behind them like ghosts. They arrived at his home as the sun bled a final blood-orange stain across the western sky. It was not a cabin, not even a teepee. It was a wickiup, a simple, sturdy frame of bent wood covered in brush and hides, nestled against a low bluff that shielded it from the worst of the wind. It was a dwelling that seemed to have grown from the land rather than being forced upon it. It was isolated, a solitary human mark on a vast, indifferent canvas. A small, dead fire pit sat at its center. A few clay pots were stacked neatly against the wall. Tanned hides were rolled and tied with rawhide. It was a place of stark function, clean and ordered, but it held a hollowness, an echo of absence. On a low shelf carved into the rock face sat a small, intricately beaded pouch and a single gray hawk feather. They seemed different from the rest of the dwelling's contents, softer, holding a memory he did not disturb. He dropped his pack just inside the entrance and gestured for her to enter. She hesitated on the threshold, a creature of cages uncertain of an open door. He did not press her. He moved to the fire pit, kneeling to clear the old ash. His movements were economical and precise. He laid a bed of dry tinder, struck a flint, and soon a small flame flickered, then caught, pushing back the encroaching chill of dusk. The firelight cast his face in planes of light and shadow, carving deep lines around his eyes and mouth. He looked older in the dancing light, burdened. He took a strip of dried meat from his pack, held it over the flames to warm it, and then broke it in two. He offered her a piece. She took it, her stomach twisting with a hunger so deep it had become a part of her. She ate slowly, deliberately, chewing the tough, smoky meat until it softened. He ate his own piece, his eyes on the fire. The silence in the wickiup was different from the silence of the journey. It was a shared space, warmed by the fire, defined by the simple, profound act of breaking bread. When they were finished, he rose and unrolled a thick buffalo hide on the far side of the fire, as far from his own sleeping place as the small dwelling would allow. He laid one of the new indigo blankets over it. A bed, a safe place. He had built a fire for warmth, given her food, and made her a place to sleep. He had done all this without a single word of instruction or demand. The unspoken contract was clear. You are safe here. You are not a prisoner. He settled by the entrance, his back to the wall, pulling a thinner blanket over his shoulders. He did not lock the entrance. He did not bar it. He simply sat, a silent guardian between her and the vast, dark world outside. For the first time in a lifetime, she lay down to sleep without fear of a hand in the dark or a locked door. She stared into the flickering heart of the fire, the indigo blanket soft beneath her cheek, and listened to the sound of another person's breathing, steady and slow in the quiet dark. The days settled into a rhythm, marked by the sun's slow arc across the immense, pale sky. A routine grew between them, built not of words, but of shared tasks and quiet observation. He would be gone before she woke, vanishing into the gray pre-dawn to check his traps or hunt. He would return in the afternoon, a rabbit or two slung over his shoulder, his presence announced by the soft scuff of his moccasins on the hard-packed earth. She, in turn, found her own work. At first, she simply swept the dirt floor of the wickiup with a branch of sage. The sharp, clean scent a small rebellion against the lingering memory of filth and neglect. Then she began to tend the fire, ensuring it never died completely, banking the coals at night so that a puff of breath in the morning could bring it back to life. She learned the heft of the water jug, the path to the spring, the weight of the silence. She watched him work. His hands, when tanning a hide, were impossibly skilled. He moved with a focused grace, scraping, stretching, rubbing the brains into the skin with a patience that seemed infinite. He was mending the world one piece at a time. He taught her without teaching, leaving a pile of yucca leaves by the entrance one afternoon. She watched him braid a rope from them, his fingers weaving the tough fibers together, and the next day, she began her own clumsy attempt. He did not correct her, but later, he left a smoother, more pliable bundle of leaves for her to practice with. Her acts of care were just as quiet. She found a patch of wild onions and dug them up, leaving them near the cooking pot. That evening, their sharp, savory flavor was in their stew. She saw him favoring his left shoulder one day and, remembering a balm her grandmother used to make, she gathered juniper and rendered the fat from a rabbit, making a small pot of salve. She left it on the rock shelf, next to the hawk feather. The next morning it was gone. He never mentioned it, but he moved his shoulder with more ease. One afternoon, she wandered to the low rise behind the wickiup. There, under a lone, twisted cedar, was a single grave marked by a pile of stones. It was small, a child's grave. There were no flowers, no carvings, just the silent, patient stones. Something in her chest, a place that had been hard and barren for years, seemed to soften. She found a cluster of hardy purple asters growing in a fissure in the rock and laid them gently on the mound. When Hocketh returned, he saw her walking back from the rise. He stopped, his gaze following hers to the grave, now dotted with color. He looked at her, a long, unreadable look, and then gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement, a thank you, a sharing of grief. One evening, a week or maybe a month into this new life, time had become fluid, measured in sunsets and meals rather than days. She was trying to cook a small loaf of bread on a hot, flat stone by the fire. It was a disaster. The outside was charred black, the inside a gluey, uncooked paste. She stared at it in frustration, poking the blackened crust with a stick. "That loaf died in vain," he said from across the fire. The words, so unexpected, startled her. She looked up, a flicker of something, not quite a smile, but the memory of one, touched the corners of his mouth. It was the first time he had spoken of anything but necessity. "It is a little dry," she managed to say, her voice thin and rough from disuse. It sounded like it belonged to someone else. "You did not complain about mine," he replied, his tone perfectly even. A small, choked laugh escaped her. It was a rusty, painful sound, but it was real. "Yours did not fight back." He considered this for a moment. "Fire only changes what is ready to be changed," he said, his gaze returning to the flames. "Some things must be softened first." The conversation ended there, but it left a warmth in the air that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a bridge built of a few simple words, a shared moment of failure and dry humor. The space between them felt smaller that night. The true softening came on a night when the wind turned mean, shrieking around the bluff like a hungry animal. A storm had blown in, cold and violent, spitting sleet that hissed against the hides of the wickiup. She was jerked from a shallow sleep by a dream of a locked door and Silas's jeering face. She sat bolt upright, her heart hammering against her ribs, a cry caught in her throat. The darkness of the wickiup felt tight, suffocating. "Don't lock me in," she whispered, the words torn from a place of old terror. Across the fire, Hocketh stirred. He did not light a lamp or speak. He simply sat up, his silhouette a solid shape against the faint glow of the embers. He remained there, a silent, sleepless sentinel, until the first gray light of dawn crept through the entrance flap. He did not question her fear or offer empty comforts. He simply shared the darkness with her, and his presence was enough to keep the ghosts at bay. Later that morning, as she sat mending a tear in one of the indigo blankets, her hands finally steady, she found her voice again. "Why?" she asked, the single word hanging in the quiet air. "Why did you take me?" He was sharpening his knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape the only sound. He did not stop his work. "The blankets were for my son's grave," he said, his voice low and flat. "For the winter. But the stones are heavy enough to keep him warm." He paused, his hands stilling. He looked at her, his eyes clear of pity, full of a plain, hard truth. "And my wife. She did not like the quiet." He turned back to his knife, the scraping sound resuming its steady rhythm. But the hollowness in the wickiup was gone. It had been filled, not with noise, but with the names of his ghosts. He had given her a piece of his own brokenness, a trust more profound than any promise. She stitched the raw edges of the blanket together, her fingers nimble and sure, and felt as if she were stitching their two solitary lives together with the same raw, sturdy thread. "You are either the kindest man I have ever met," she thought, "or the most foolish." He looked up then as if he'd heard her. a long, considering look, and she had the startling thought that maybe he could be both. The harbinger of the past did not come as a letter or a rumor. It came as 3 riders, dark shapes that crested the eastern ridge one searingly bright afternoon. They were small at first, no more than specks against the vast, empty blue of the sky, but she knew. A cold dread, a familiar sickness, coiled in her stomach. She had been foolish to believe this sanctuary was permanent. Haketh saw them too. He had been stretching a deer hide on a frame, and his hands went still. He straightened up, his body a single tense line, his eyes narrowed against the sun. He watched the riders for a long time as they picked their way down the rocky slope, their progress slow and deliberate. There was a predatory confidence in their movement. "Go inside," he said. His voice quiet but sharp with an edge she had never heard before. It was the voice of a man preparing for a fight. She did not argue. She slipped into the dimness of the wickiup, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. But she did not hide. She went to the wall where his spare bow was hung, its sinew backing thick and strong. Her hands were clumsy on it. She had never held a weapon before. She took a single arrow, its flint head chipped to a wicked point. She knelt just inside the entrance, the rough fabric of the hide brushing her cheek, peering through a small gap. The world outside was framed in a narrow slit, a stage for the coming confrontation. The riders came to a stop 20 yards from the wickiup. The man in the middle was Silas. His face was puffy and red from the sun, his fancy town coat stained with dust and sweat. He looked smaller here, diminished by the sheer scale of the land. The 2 men with him were hired muscle, their faces blank and brutal. "Well now," Silas called out, forcing a smile that did not reach his cold, piggish eyes. "Look at this. Playing house, are we?" He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Haketh did not reply. He stood his ground between the riders and the home he had built, his arms loose at his sides. He was not armed, but he seemed more dangerous than the 2 men with rifles resting across their saddles. "I've come for my property," Silas said, his voice rising, shedding its pretense of civility. "That was a lone Indian. A temporary arrangement. You got your work out of her. Now I'll be taking her back." "She is not property," Haketh said. The words were flat, immutable, a statement of fact, not an argument. Silas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that grated on the stillness. "Oh, she is. Bought and paid for by her own father, sold to me to settle a debt. I have a paper, a bill of sale. Makes her mine, same as my horse." He patted the neck of his mount. "Now, are you going to hand her over? Or do my boys here need to persuade you?" One of the hired men shifted his rifle, the movement casual but full of menace. Inside the wickiup, her knuckles were white around the shaft of the arrow. She could feel the tremors in her arms, the terror that threatened to paralyze her, the old fear, the instinct to be still, to be invisible, to endure. But then she saw Haketh. He did not look at his home where she was hidden. He did not look at the rifles. He looked only at Silas, his contempt a palpable force. He was not just protecting a dwelling. He was protecting a life. Her life. The life they had built in the quiet spaces between words. The fire only changes what is ready to be changed. And something inside her, softened by quiet kindnesses and shared grief, was finally, irrevocably ready. Silas dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. He started to walk toward the wickiup, his hand reaching out as if to shove Haketh aside. "Enough of this, and get out here." Hearing the name, the old name, the name of the girl who stared at cracks in the floor was like a slap. It was the name of a ghost, and she was not a ghost anymore. Haketh moved then, not with violence, but with a speed that was startling. He stepped directly into Silas's path, a living wall. "Her name is not Anne. I don't care what you call her," Silas snarled, his face contorting with rage. "She's mine." "No," a voice said, thin but clear. All 4 men froze. The voice had come from the wickiup. She stepped out of the shadows and into the harsh, unforgiving sunlight. She was no longer the barefoot girl in a ragged shift. She wore a simple buckskin dress he had made for her, and on her feet were soft moccasins. Her hair was braided, and her face, though pale with fear, was set with a resolve she did not know she possessed. In her hand, she held the bow and arrow, the point aimed squarely at Silas's chest. She was shaking so hard the arrowhead trembled, but she held her ground. Her movement, her voice, her defiance, it was a reclamation. Silas stared at her, his jaw slack with disbelief. He saw not the cowed, silent creature he had traded away, but a stranger, a woman holding a weapon. His eyes flicked from the arrow to her face, and for the first time he saw not weakness, but something that might hurt him. "What is this?" he stammered, taking an involuntary step back. "Put that down, you stupid girl." "I am not a girl," she said, her voice gaining strength. "And I am not yours." The two hired guns looked at each other, then at Silas. This was not what they had been paid for. They were here to intimidate a lone Indian and retrieve a compliant woman, not get into a fight that might leave one of them with an arrow in the gut. The money wasn't good enough for that. Hocketh never took his eyes off Silas, but he spoke to her. "Nami," he said, the name a soft command, a reminder. "Lower the bow." She hesitated, her gaze locked on Silas. "He is not worth the arrow," Hocketh said, his voice calm and steady. Slowly, her arms trembling with the strain, she lowered the bow. But she did not drop it. She stood beside Hocketh, the two of them a unified, unyielding front. They did not touch, but the space between them was charged with an unbreakable alliance. Silas looked from Hocketh's cold, unwavering stare to the woman who was no longer and who stood ready to defend her new life with deadly force. He saw two people who would die before they would break. And he was not a man willing to die for anything, least of all his own wounded pride. His bluster crumbled into dust. "Keep her," he spat, his voice thick with venom. "She's as wild as he is now. They deserve each other." He turned, scrambled back onto his horse with a clumsy heave, and spurred the animal hard, not looking back. His men, relief plain on their faces, wheeled their own horses around and followed, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the air long after they were gone. They stood together in the ringing silence, watching the dust settle. The land, which had been a battleground moments before, was quiet again, their own. She was still trembling, the adrenaline a sickening, electric hum beneath her skin. The bow felt impossibly heavy in her hand. "I was scared," she whispered to the quiet air. "I know," Hocketh said. He reached out and gently took the bow from her fingers. His hand covered hers for a moment, his touch warm and firm. It was not a gesture of passion, but of acknowledgement, of shared victory. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw a deep, quiet pride. "You did not run. You did not let them take me," she answered. He gave a single, slow nod. The unspoken was finally spoken. They were a we, a fortress of two against the world. That night, the fire in the wickiup burned brighter. The unspoken fear that had shadowed their quiet life was gone, burned away by the heat of the confrontation. They had faced the past together and had won. The bond between them, forged in silence and small kindnesses, was now sealed in shared courage. He sat across the flames from her, working a piece of soft leather with a bone awl. She was mending the tear in the indigo blanket again, the one from the night of her terror. The familiar, rhythmic work was calming. "Nami," he said into the comfortable quiet. She looked up. "It is a good name for you," he said. He did not elaborate, did not explain that it meant to move, to dance, a celebration of the spirit's motion. He did not need to. He had given her the meaning on the ridge. She who stands her ground. She felt her own name settle over her, a mantle of strength and belonging. She was no longer surplus. She was no longer a ghost named N. She was Nami. It was a name earned, a name that fit. In the days that followed, a new peace settled over them. The final ghost had been exorcised. The next morning, she took the tattered, filthy shift she had arrived in, the last relic of her old life, and without ceremony, she laid it in the fire. She watched it curl, blacken, and turn to ash, the smoke rising thin and gray into the morning sky. It was a release, a baptism by fire. Later that week, he spent a day rebuilding the stone pile on his son's grave, making it taller, more solid. When he was done, she went and placed a fresh spray of purple asters on top. It was not just his grief anymore. It was theirs to tend together. The house, the wickiup, no longer felt haunted by absence. It breathed. It was full. They never married in the way of the white men, with papers and a preacher. Their union was quieter, deeper. It was in the way he left the warmest spot by the fire for her. It was in the way she knew exactly how he liked his stew. It was in the shared silence as they sat outside the wickiup in the evenings, watching the stars ignite one by one in the vast, dark expanse. Their lives were woven together now, a cord of two strands, stronger than either had been alone. One evening, as the first chill of autumn sharpened the air, they sat on the bluff overlooking the valley. The world below was painted in the soft, muted colors of dusk. He had his arm around her shoulders, a casual gesture of possession and protection that was now as natural as breathing. She leaned her head against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. The land was no longer harsh or indifferent. It was home. It was a sanctuary they had defended and sanctified with their own courage. She was no longer the girl who stared at cracks to avoid the world. She looked out at the horizon, at the endless sweep of the land and the sky, and she was not afraid. He had not just saved her from Silas. He had carried her out of the wreckage of her own life and given her the space to find the person she was meant to be. He had given her a name, and with it, he had given her back to herself. The fire had changed everything, because something new had been waiting in the ash. This story, it isn't just about a rescue. It isn't just about a Comanche warrior and a girl the world threw away. It's a story about what it means to be truly seen. We all have moments, don't we, when we feel like we're on that dusty patch of ground with the crowd whispering, feeling like we're worthless, like we're surplus. We're given a name by our parents, by our past, by our mistakes, and sometimes that name feels like a cage. But this story says that real connection, the kind that remakes the world, is about finding someone who ignores the crowd. Someone who doesn't look at the price tag the world has put on you, but who looks right through to the person underneath. Someone who sees the fighter in you when all you feel is fear. Someone who gives you a new name. Not a name to own you, but a name to free you. A name that says, I see who you are. I see who you are becoming. So here is your naming. In the quiet moments of your own life, look for the person who offers you water without asking for thanks. The one who sits with you in the dark without needing to fill it with words. That's where you find your Haketh. And if you're brave enough to step out of the shadows to pick up your own bow and say, I am not yours, well, you might just find that you're not the person you thought you were. You're Nami. You're the one who stands your ground. And that is a meaning worth fighting for.